What if your dog isn't just a pet, but a guardian of something you were never meant to see? Imagine that every bark, every stare into the empty hallway, every restless night was a warning. You were never told that some animals respond to shifts in human consciousness, or even protect us from what lies beyond. And maybe, just maybe, they've been trying to tell us all along. There's a hidden prophecy, long buried, spoken by Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. He revealed that animals are more than companions, they are spiritual instruments in times of great change. 99% of people ignore what happens when reality begins to distort, but the animals never do. And now, the signs are multiplying, but almost no one is paying attention. If you've ever felt something staring back at you through your dog's eyes, if the silence before the bark feels louder than the bark itself, then this message was meant for you. This is your moment to unlock a deeper truth, but only if you're ready. There's something deeply unsettling about watching a dog freeze in silence, eyes locked onto an empty corner of the room. No sound, no movement, just an unblinking stare into what appears to be nothing. And yet, in that nothing, a presence lingers. If you've ever caught your dog doing this in the dead of night, you've probably felt it too. An inexplicable chill, a weight in the air, a question rising quietly inside. What is it seeing that I can't? Science would say it's just instinct, heightened senses, a smell in the air, a shadow outside the window. But what if instinct is just the polite word we use for something we're too afraid to name? A study published in Scientific Reports Nature 2020 confirms that dogs detect chemical changes in our bodies long before we show symptoms of illness. That's not intuition. That's perception operating on a plane we no longer access. And yet, what if it goes even further? The Navajo people believe dogs guard the threshold between the living and the spirit world. Not metaphorically, literally. According to them, when a dog barks at a wall or watches a hallway as if someone just walked through it, someone might have. And then there's Edgar Cayce, who once described certain animals as instruments of vibrational purification, capable of absorbing and alerting us to energies that don't belong. What was he really saying? Were they just guardians or translators of another reality? I came across a woman's story on the Spirit Chronicles channel, where her dog barked every single night at the same corner of her bedroom wall. She tried incense. She tried prayers. Nothing worked. Until weeks later, doctors found a tumor in her lung, directly aligned with where the dog had been staring. Coincidence? Maybe. But how many coincidences are we allowed before we start asking real questions? Why do these events happen in silence? Why do the signs come through beings that can't speak, can't write, can't explain what they know? Perhaps because words would never be enough. Perhaps because there are warnings that must be felt to be understood. And if that's true, then how many messages have we ignored just because we didn't know how to listen? You may think your dog is just barking at shadows, but what if those shadows are staring back, waiting for you to notice them? And it's only when you finally do that everything else begins to shift. Imagine a soul so ancient, so intricately tied to your path, that it chooses to return not as a person, but as a dog. Not to speak, but to stay. To walk beside you, not ahead. In one of Edgar Cayce's lesser-known readings, number 442-5, he mentioned something rarely discussed, that certain animal spirits return to assist us during times of personal or planetary transition. He didn't expand on it. The sentence ends abruptly, but the weight of it still lingers, like a door cracked open to a secret most would rather leave untouched. In the modern world, we often laugh off the idea of a reincarnated animal. It sounds poetic, maybe comforting, but not real. And yet, in Kim Sheridan's book Animals and the Afterlife, case after case documents people recognizing behaviors, patterns, and even specific habits in a new pet, identical to a previous one that had passed. These aren't vague feelings. They're precise, sometimes shocking. One woman's new dog responded to the same nickname, only used privately for the pet that died. No training, no time, just instant recognition. What does that say about memory? About soul? There's a spiritual therapist in Lyon, France, known simply as the Nuke, who works with regression techniques. She says that some dogs under deep meditative touch display bodily reactions that mirror human trauma, flinching, shaking, even weeping. Once, during a session, a dog began breathing in sync with a patient, matching her heartbeat. When asked what she thought it meant, Anouk simply said, "Some beings remember," even without words. Philosophers like Plotinus once believed that the soul was not bound to human form, but moved through expressions, each one chosen for a lesson, for a purpose. If that's true, what does it mean when a dog follows you everywhere, stares into your eyes like it knows something you've forgotten? Could it be more than love? Could it be a vow? And more disturbingly, what if it has something to teach you that no one else can? We're taught that teachers speak, that guidance comes with structure. But maybe the most important messages come in silence, in instinct, in presence. What if your dog didn't choose you by chance, but because you were about to make a decision that would echo across lifetimes? Maybe that's why it waits by the door at night, alert, watching, not you, but what moves behind you. Because once the guide arrives, things begin to move around you, often invisibly, until the day you realize you weren't the one choosing the path all along. There's something uncanny about the way a dog looks at you when no one else is watching. Not playful, not demanding, just present, completely still. Their eyes don't dart like ours, they study, as if scanning something beyond your words. And in those moments, it almost feels like they know something about you that you haven't dared to admit to yourself. Have you ever wondered why that gaze sometimes feels like a mirror turned inward? Scientists at Emory University used fMRI scans to study how dogs react to human faces and voices. What they found shocked even the researchers. The areas activated in a dog's brain when seeing their human were nearly identical to those linked with emotional empathy in humans. In simpler terms, they don't just recognize you. They feel you, not just your face or scent, but the emotional signature behind your silence, the sadness you hide, the fear you push away, the energy behind your smile. There's a theory by Greg Braden, one that bridges ancient wisdom and quantum biology, stating that all living beings emit a unique frequency, like a personal code written in emotion, and that some animals, especially dogs, are wired to detect shifts in that field. Have you noticed how your dog reacts when you're anxious before you've even moved? Or when you're about to cry, even if your face hasn't changed? That's not intuition. That's decoding. I've heard countless stories, but one stays with me. A man on Reddit shared how, during the darkest months of his depression, his dog would sit just inches from him, refusing to move, even growling softly if he tried to close the bedroom door. He said it wasn't comfort. It felt like a warning, a refusal to let him disconnect completely. He later described that gaze as like being seen by something that refused to look away, even when I wanted it to. That stare saved his life. Philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote that the face is an ethical summons, a call to responsibility. But what if that applies not only to humans? What if your dog's gaze isn't just affection, but a quiet challenge? A question asked without words: are you still present? Or have you already disappeared from yourself? Because when a dog looks at you like that, silent, still, unwavering, it may not be trying to understand you, but to remind you of something you once understood and lost. There's a moment, almost always quiet, when a dog suddenly becomes still, not out of fear, not distraction, but as if listening to something that hasn't happened yet. You'll notice it right before a tragedy, a loss, or an unexplainable shift in the atmosphere. Some people dismiss it as coincidence, but others, they remember that stillness forever. What if your dog isn't reacting to what is, but to what's about to be? In hospitals across the United States, there are now reports of therapy dogs behaving strangely just hours before a patient's passing. In one case documented in The Dog Who Couldn't Stop Loving by Jeffrey Massafe Masson, a golden retriever consistently lay beside terminal patients, never the recovering ones. No one trained him to do that. He just knew. Doctors began to quietly track it. The dog was never wrong. But how do you measure the smell of death when no test can find it? Some scientists say it's chemistry, changes in scent, skin temperature, hormone levels. But others are starting to question, is that really all it is? Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic fields suggests that beings are linked by invisible fields of shared information, outside space and time. Dogs, he says, may tap into those fields instinctively, sensing energetic shifts long before the human body shows signs. Could death itself be an energetic signature, one that animals feel like a pressure wave through the soul? In 2011, after the Fukushima earthquake, hundreds of dogs across Japan exhibited bizarre behavior, scratching at doors, howling at walls, refusing to eat hours before the quake hit. The event was sudden and for many people, devastating. But the dogs had already warned their families. Some listened. Most didn't. Science struggled to explain it. There were no unusual electromagnetic pulses recorded in advance. Nothing measurable, but something was felt. There's an ancient belief, passed through African, Celtic, and indigenous traditions, that dogs serve as death walkers, not bringers of death, but escorts. They don't just sense the end. They guard the transition, not out of fear, but loyalty to the souls they protect. Maybe that's why they sleep at our feet. Why they bark when we're alone. Why they sometimes howl at nothing just before the phone rings. Because perhaps what we call nothing is where death begins whispering before it's even arrived. There's a quiet moment just before your dog twitches in its sleep, when something changes in the air. The breath slows, the body stiffens slightly, and then the movements begin. A paw kicks, the nose quivers, sometimes a soft whimper escapes. We tell ourselves they're chasing rabbits in a dream. But what if they're not? What if their dreams take them somewhere else, somewhere you've never dared to look? At MIT, neuroscientist Matthew Wilson conducted experiments on rats that revealed astonishing results. During REM sleep, their brain activity mirrored the exact patterns recorded while awake, replaying detailed memories of paths they had walked. Now, imagine that in a dog whose spatial memory and emotional connection to its environment are far deeper. If memory returns that vividly in sleep, what else might resurface? Many dog owners on Reddit have described their pets waking up in terror, bolting upright, barking violently at empty spaces, or pacing for hours afterward. Some even report their dogs staring at the ceiling after these episodes, refusing to re-enter the same room. It's easy to dismiss as instinct, but traditions in Tibetan Buddhism teach that dogs guard the human soul not just in life, but in the dream state. They're said to roam the bardo, the realm between waking and death, warding off entities drawn to vulnerable consciousness. What if the dreams of dogs aren't projections of physical memory, but glimpses into that space? And what if they're not dreaming about you, but dreaming for you? Protecting your sleeping body by entering territories your conscious mind is too fragile to explore. In ancient Sumerian beliefs, dogs were depicted beside gates, gatekeepers not of homes, but of realms. The image survives in statues, in myths, in temples half buried by time. Science can monitor REM cycles. It can map neurons, but it cannot yet measure what is seen in those moments of stillness. It cannot tell you why a dog wakes up barking at a wall, then sits for hours, quietly watching something you can't see. Maybe they bring back something from those dreams. A message, a residue, a warning. Because when the dream ends and their eyes open wide, staring not at you but past you, it's already too late to ask where they've been and what followed them back. You've heard it 1,000 times, your dog barking in the middle of the night. Sometimes sharp and frantic, sometimes low and guttural. It jolts you awake, heart racing. You get up, look around, see nothing, and go back to sleep. But the sound lingers. It stays in the air, heavy, vibrating in a way that doesn't quite feel natural. What if that bark isn't just noise? What if it's a kind of signal, one your body hears, but your mind refuses to understand? At the University of Sussex, researchers discovered that dogs modulate the pitch and rhythm of their bark, depending on the emotional state of the human nearby. But that's only the beginning. What they didn't explain is why those sounds seem to trigger a visceral reaction in us, a tightness in the chest, a sudden sense of dread or protection. David Wilcock, in his lectures on vibrational fields, suggests that sound carries encoded frequencies that don't just pass through the ears, they enter the body, influencing our energy field directly. Could dogs be channeling more than emotion when they bark? In ancient Japanese Shinto practice, there's a little-known technique called inugami shokan, a form of spiritual communication where dogs are believed to vocalize disturbances in the surrounding energetic space. Not to scare, but to alert, to shift the energy or repel something unseen. It's a concept echoed by healers and shamans across cultures. Certain animals emit frequencies that function like protective mantras, not by choice, but by design. There's a case that surfaced on the Awakening World podcast about a spiritual counselor in Mexico whose dog would bark every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., always in the same direction, toward the same empty wall. But when she began recording the sound and replaying it during healing sessions, her clients reported intense emotional releases, grief, memories, even visions. The bark, she believed, wasn't just reactive. It was a kind of vibrational purge, a warning that carried power. Modern psychology tries to explain this as emotional contagion, that your dog is simply mirroring your stress. But what if it's not reacting to your emotion, but adjusting it? What if that bark you've been shushing is actually recalibrating the room around you, breaking patterns, clearing static, dissolving what doesn't belong? And what happens when you ignore it long enough? Because there's a difference between sound and signal. And when a dog barks at nothing, sometimes it's not what you're hearing. It's what you're being protected from hearing. There's a particular kind of silence that follows the sudden disappearance of a dog. It's not just absence, it's disorientation. One day they're there, watching you with those knowing eyes, and the next, they're simply gone. No warning, no illness, sometimes not even a goodbye. And you're left with a feeling that doesn't make sense. Not just grief, but confusion, as if something ended before you even knew it had begun. Across spiritual circles, especially within the spiritist communities in Brazil, there's a belief that some animals are temporary companions, karmic guardians whose presence is not meant to be lifelong, but precisely timed. Their mission isn't to stay with you forever, but to accompany you until a specific shift occurs. A breakup, a new phase, a trauma, a decision. And once that moment happens, once the energy they came to stabilize has been moved, they leave. Sometimes through death. Sometimes they just disappear. A therapist in Barcelona once shared, in an interview for Cuerpo y Alma magazine, how her dog passed away suddenly after she overcame a lifelong phobia that had paralyzed her for years. She had never linked the two. But in the weeks that followed, her dreams changed. Her body felt lighter. Her intuition sharpened. She said, "It was like he carried away something I couldn't see, but had been holding me down my whole life." What exactly had he taken with him? Philosophers like Schopenhauer believed animals have no future. They live fully in the present, and in doing so, anchor us to it. But what if that presence is also a form of spiritual work? A quiet alchemy unfolding by your side. And when their work is complete, when the frequency between you shifts, they don't die in vain. They return, not to Earth, but to whatever realm they came from, mission fulfilled. That's not sentiment. That's a pattern, one seen in stories around the world, repeated too often to ignore. You may have blamed yourself for not seeing the signs, for not being prepared, for not stopping it. But maybe you weren't supposed to. Maybe their leaving was the sign. A signal that something inside you had changed irrevocably. Something they came to witness and to protect while it unfolded. And maybe, just maybe, that departure wasn't lost, but the closing of a gate you didn't know had ever been open. Have you ever noticed how your dog becomes restless before a storm, hours before the sky even darkens? Or how they pace the house, ears alert, days before you receive life-changing news? Most people brush it off, just instinct, they say. But instinct doesn't explain why some dogs dig at the floor before an earthquake, or why they refuse to enter a room where someone later falls ill. At what point does instinct become something else entirely? Dr. Joseph Chilton Pearce, in his studies on the preverbal brain, proposed that animals, and especially dogs, operate in a state of direct perception, responding not just to physical stimuli, but to fields of emotional and environmental resonance. In simple terms, they don't wait for events to happen. They feel them building, and often they act before we even know we should. not through logic, but through an intelligence older than words. After the Fukushima earthquake in 2011, hundreds of dogs in nearby cities began acting erratically, barking at empty streets, refusing to eat, clawing at closed doors to get outside. Hours later, the disaster struck. Similar stories emerged after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and even during the attacks of September 11th. It wasn't panic. It was precision. A quiet, internal alarm that rang only for them, because they were still listening to something we forgot how to hear. Rupert Sheldrake's controversial but compelling theory of morphic resonance suggests that all beings are linked through invisible informational fields, that thoughts, traumas, and changes in the collective mind ripple through these fields. Your dog, then, isn't reacting to your behavior. It's reacting to the shift before it becomes behavior. A sadness not yet spoken, a threat not yet seen, a change not yet revealed. And sometimes that reaction is the only warning you'll get. A family in the Appalachian Mountains told a local news channel how their dog wouldn't stop pacing the backyard for 2 days. He growled at the trees, barked toward the earth. Then, at 3 a.m. on the third night, a landslide hit the back of the house, collapsing the room the dog had refused to enter. No human sensed the shift, but he did. Was that luck? Or are we surrounded by guardians whose warnings we've trained ourselves to ignore? Because if dogs are the sentinels standing between us and the invisible, then what happens when we stop listening and the silence grows louder than the warning? There are moments when words fail. When nothing you say, nothing anyone offers seems to reach the pain sitting deep inside you. And then your dog comes and simply lies next to you. No explanation, no advice, just presence. Still, grounded, real. And suddenly, the air feels different, as if something inside you has been gently pulled back from the edge. Could it be that healing doesn't always come through action, but through resonance? In Japan, a little-known energy therapy called Inu Reiji uses the resting presence of dogs as a healing modality. Practitioners believe the animal's biofield naturally synchronizes with the person's, pulling chaotic emotional frequencies into balance without effort. The HeartMath Institute in the US has also studied this effect, showing that when a human sits calmly with a dog, both their heart rhythms begin to mirror each other, creating what scientists call coherence. But if that's measurable, then what else is happening beneath that calm? Therapists working with PTSD patients often describe something extraordinary. Clients who've resisted years of talk therapy suddenly begin to release buried memories and emotions simply by sitting with the dog. Not because of comfort, but because of trust, the kind that bypasses language and logic. Some neuroscientists suggest this is due to oxytocin release. But no chemical fully explains the feeling of being seen without judgment, of being held energetically without being touched. One war veteran shared his story in a documentary by Healing Paws. He had stopped speaking for almost a year, until a Labrador named Mercy was assigned to him. Within weeks, his body relaxed. His sleep improved, and one morning he spoke again for the first time, looking directly into her eyes. "I didn't feel alone anymore," he said. "It's like she pulled me out of the place I couldn't leave on my own." Not helped, pulled. That's something entirely different. Spiritual philosophies from India to the Andes speak of certain beings whose vibration holds the frequency of anchoring, a stabilizing force meant to hold the energetic body in alignment with the soul's original state. Is it possible that some dogs were born into your life not to walk beside you, but to hold you steady while you fall apart and rebuild? Because when everything else collapses and only your dog remains beside you, silent, breathing, present, that's not coincidence. That's the medicine the world forgot, waiting at your feet. There are places in your home where your dog lingers, unmoving, not resting, watching. You may not notice it at first, but over time, it becomes hard to ignore. Always the same spot, always at the same hour, and sometimes with a look that isn't fear, but alertness, as if something is passing through, a current you can't see, but they can feel. Could it be that your dog isn't just reacting to space, but holding space? And for what exactly? In the teachings of Sri Aurobindo, there is mention of Devic conduits, living beings that unknowingly function as bridges between material and subtle realms. Most assume this refers to plants or sacred sites. But among initiates, there's a whispered belief that some animals, particularly dogs, are living portals, vessels through which energy moves in and out of our physical dimension. And the question is no longer if it happens, but what travels with it. An interview aired by BBC Africa with a priest of the Yoruba tradition revealed a startling view. "Dogs are not animals," he said calmly. "They are the ancestors with eyes." In ritual settings, they are placed at the edge of ceremonial circles, not to guard, but to receive, to stand at the threshold where intention becomes manifestation. According to him, the dog senses not just the visible energies, but the uninvited ones, the ones that attach themselves quietly to emotion, thought, and trauma. One of the most chilling accounts came from a Spanish channel, Misterios Despiertos, where a woman shared dozens of ritual photos taken across several years. In nearly all of them, the same dog appears, even in rituals he wasn't present for. Not a similar dog. The same one. Same eyes. Same collar. She didn't understand it. She thought it was a camera glitch. But spiritualists who reviewed the footage suggested something else. The dog might not have been appearing in body, but in presence. So what does this mean for the rest of us? Those with dogs who suddenly fixate on doorways, corners, stairwells? Are they seeing what we refuse to believe exists? Or are they bridging it? Filtering what could overwhelm us if it came through unfiltered? And if that's the case, then who or what walks with them when they cross the house at midnight? Because if a dog is a portal, you should ask yourself not just what it protects you from, but what it's silently allowing to pass through. There's a moment when your dog looks at you, moves toward a certain object, presses its paw down, and waits. It's not random. It's not instinct. It's communication. But most people dismiss it because it doesn't sound like speech. We expect language to come in words, but what if that assumption is the very thing that blinds us? What if dogs have been speaking all along, just not in a form we've been taught to understand? Christina Hunger, a speech-language pathologist, began teaching her dog Stella to use program buttons to express thoughts. Words like outside, want, come, love you. Within months, Stella wasn't just mimicking commands. She was forming intentional phrases. Phrases that reflected emotion, preference, and anticipation. That level of cognition isn't just clever. It's paradigm shifting. Because if a dog can learn our language, what does that say about the one they've been trying to teach us? Theoretical physicist Nassim Haramein argues that all beings are connected through a unified informational field, where intention travels faster than speech. In this model, communication is not sound, it's alignment. When your dog moves towards you before you speak, or mirrors your mood without reason, it's not magic. It's resonance. They're reading the imprint of your energy long before you vocalize it. They don't need grammar. They feel truth. One story that keeps resurfacing comes from a family in Oregon whose autistic child had never spoken a word, until the day he pressed a series of speech buttons used by the family's therapy dog. He hadn't been trained. He simply knew. His first words were through a machine designed for a dog. And in that instant, something broke open, not just in the child, but in the entire family. A new form of language was born. Not human, not canine, something between. Spiritual traditions from the Andes to the Aborigines teach that language was never meant to be limited to the throat, that the heart and the field of intention were the original vessels of communication. Perhaps dogs, in their silence, are pulling us back toward that forgotten frequency, a way of speaking that doesn't need volume, only presence, only attention, only willingness. Because when a dog repeats the same gesture, the same path, the same look, it might not be behavior. It might be a sentence spoken in a language your soul remembers, but your mind forgot. There's a moment in one of Edgar Cayce's less cited readings, number 1152-11, where he mentions something cryptic, and the animal shall guide those blind of spirit. Most skipped over it. It didn't sound prophetic enough, or perhaps it was too poetic to be taken seriously. But what did he mean by blind of spirit? And why, in a lifetime of visions and revelations, did he mark animals as potential guides, not symbols? In ancient Egypt, dogs were never just pets, they were sacred. The god Anubis, guardian of the dead, was depicted with the head of a jackal, guiding souls through the unknown corridors between life and whatever lies beyond. The same motif echoes across cultures. In the Aztec world, the Zoloid squintly was believed to escort souls through the underworld. In Tibet, dogs were seen as protectors in the bardo, the space between incarnations. Why would these spiritual systems, separated by oceans and centuries, all associate dogs with the same threshold? Cayce believed that during times of global transition, some beings would awaken to higher functions, abilities forgotten or dormant. He spoke of vibrational intelligences returning not in human form, but in whatever body was most needed to reach us. Could dogs, in their unassuming silence, be vessels for those intelligences? Could they be stepping forward now, because the world is tipping into something it doesn't yet understand? On Reddit's r/spiritual awakening, dozens of users have begun sharing nearly identical experiences. Their dogs behaving erratically around sick family members, alerting them to illnesses before diagnosis. One user described how her dog became visibly distressed, then refused to leave her mother's side, 3 days before she collapsed from an undiagnosed heart condition. Science calls this early detection. But what if it's deeper than that? What if it's spiritual alignment, the dog sensing that a soul was nearing a threshold? Carl Jung once wrote that archetypes mutate when the collective mind begins to shift. If that's true, and if we're indeed entering an age of spiritual acceleration, could it be that the archetype of the dog itself is changing, no longer just companion, but guide? A being that doesn't just walk beside us, but sees for us when our own vision has grown dim. Because when even the animals begin to behave like prophets, you have to ask, what exactly are they seeing that we no longer can? There's a kind of silence that comes only once. A silence that follows the loss of a dog who never made a sound in their final days. No whimper, no struggle, just stillness. For some, it feels peaceful. For others, it's unbearable. But for a rare few, that silence becomes a message. One that only starts to make sense long after the body is gone. And when it does, it doesn't sound like memory. It sounds like something was left behind, intentionally. In Soul Dog, author Elena Manns describes her experiences with a dog who, after passing, began to communicate with her through dreams, synchronicities, and an overwhelming presence that couldn't be explained by grief alone. Skeptical at first, she documented the visits, eventually working with animal communicators who confirmed messages she hadn't shared. These weren't fantasies. They were continuations, conversations that had simply shifted form. Many who've lost a dog report something similar. A sudden image of their pet just before falling asleep, a warm weight at the foot of the bed, or a specific sound, like the jingle of a collar at 2 a.m. when no other animal is near. These are memories playing tricks. They happen in patterns, often right before a significant life event, as if the dog had waited for that moment to return, not physically, but energetically, to deliver a final wordless message. A healer in Kerala, India, shared in a radio interview that her dog passed away just days before her awakening into what she called true sight, a sudden burst of clairvoyant perception that left her disoriented, trembling, and unable to speak for hours. She believes her dog's death triggered a release of energy she had been holding in for decades. He carried it, she said softly, so I wouldn't have to. And once I was strong enough, he left. Could it be that some dogs choose their departure as carefully as their arrival? Spiritual teachings in the Indian tradition speak of companions of the threshold, beings who walk beside a soul not to teach, but to witness. And when their witnessing is complete, they depart without fanfare, but not without purpose. Their silence is an absence. It's transmission, one that bypasses thought, emotion, even time. And if you sit long enough in that silence, you just might feel it. Because when a dog leaves without a sound, it's not the end of the story. It's the moment the real message begins to unfold without words. There's a moment, usually quiet, usually small, when your dog looks at you and something shifts. Not emotionally, but energetically. It feels like recognition. Not the casual kind you feel when a friend walks into a room, but the ancient kind, the kind that stirs something buried deep in your chest, as if a part of you is waking up in response. Could it be that what you're feeling isn't just affection, but a reunion? At the University of Vienna, a groundbreaking study revealed that dogs and humans experience synchronized oxytocin spikes simply through eye contact. But even more striking was the discovery that these moments also regulate heart rate, lower cortisol levels, and create states of physiological coherence. That's not just connection. That's entanglement. Two beings vibrating in harmony, as if they were never really separate to begin with. So the question arises, what came before the meeting? In his symposium, Plato speaks of soulmates as beings who were once whole, torn apart and destined to find each other again. Not always romantically, but always cosmically. Who said this only applies to humans? In countless spiritual traditions, from the Celts to the Lakota, animals are seen as fragments of our spirit lineage. Allies, mirrors. Some even say they are the incarnations of agreements we made long before this life began. What if your dog didn't just find you? What if it returned? One man from Brazil shared, in a podcast titled Entre Almas, how he dreamed of a dog every night for weeks before meeting his real-life pet. In the dream, they were running across vast fields, no leash, no name. When he visited the shelter weeks later, the exact dog from his dreams stood at the corner of the room, silent, staring. He didn't hesitate. He said it felt like home entered the room and waited for him to catch up. Quantum theorists talk about non-locality, the idea that two particles, once connected, remain linked no matter the distance. What if consciousness works the same way? What if you and your dog are parts of the same pattern, the same original spark, drawn back together not by need, but by memory? Not the kind you can access with thought, but the kind your heart recognizes without permission. Because when a dog sits at your feet, refusing to leave, refusing to let go, maybe it's not loyalty. Maybe it's the silent echo of a promise you made long before you ever had a name. There's something unsettling happening around the world, and it's not on the news. More and more people are noticing that their dogs are acting different. Not just anxious or excited, but alert in a way that feels almost deliberate. They stare into corners longer. They avoid certain rooms. They whimper at strange hours. Some even begin pacing in circles with no apparent cause. It's subtle but consistent, as if something is shifting and they can sense the tremor before the quake. Among the lesser-known writings found after Edgar Cayce's death were incomplete notes on what he called the age of the animal emissary. In them, he hints that when a planetary transition begins, an inner realignment between spirit and matter, some animals will no longer behave as animals. Their roles will change, their senses will sharpen, and they will begin to guide rather than follow. But only those attuned to their presence will recognize the signs. The rest will miss the warning. On YouTube, channels like Uncharted Realms and Awakening Humanity have begun documenting first-hand accounts. Dogs howling during solar storms, refusing to walk at certain hours, or growling at family members after intense emotional episodes. This isn't about fear. It's about reaction to vibration. During the last solstice, a surge of such reports flooded Reddit's spiritual forums, people asking, "Why is my dog suddenly watching me like I'm about to disappear?" The question sounds dramatic until you've seen the look yourself. Carl Jung once wrote that archetypes mutate when the psyche prepares for transition. Dogs, long held as symbols of loyalty and innocence, may be shifting into something else, something closer to the mythic guardians of old. Less pet, more sentinel. Less follower, more initiator. What if the archetype of the dog is evolving because we are supposed to follow them now? What if they're moving into alignment with a world that hasn't fully arrived yet, but is already being felt? So pay attention. When your dog starts acting strange, not once, but over and over, don't dismiss it. Observe. Listen. Because in a world increasingly disconnected from instinct, your dog may be the last thread linking you to a truth that can't be explained, only remembered. Not with the mind, but with something older, deeper. Because when the dogs stop behaving like dogs, it won't just be a sign that they've changed. It'll be the sign that everything has. Sometimes, your dog looks at you with an intensity that feels almost too human. Not playful, not obedient, just still listening. But listening to what? You haven't said a word. You haven't moved. And yet they tilt their head, change their breath, or suddenly come closer, as if they heard something you were only beginning to think. We call it intuition. But what if it's something more precise, more scientific, and far more unsettling? In studies conducted at Harvard Medical School, researchers found that dogs detect subtle neural and muscular cues in humans before we consciously act. Micro movements, micro energies. But here's the part that wasn't widely discussed. In some cases, dogs began responding to emotional decisions their owners hadn't even verbalized yet. Not just body language, but intention itself. Could it be that our thoughts aren't locked inside us and our dogs are hearing what we've been told is silent? Dean Radin, from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, suggests that consciousness is not limited to the brain. It's a field, a non-local intelligence that flows between beings. When two minds are emotionally bonded, information may pass instantly between them, bypassing words or time. In this model, your dog isn't just reacting, it's receiving thoughts, fears, shifts in emotional geometry. This would explain why they comfort you before the tears, or hide just before you lose your temper. It's not a sixth sense, it's resonance. One woman, interviewed anonymously on the Site Today podcast, spoke of her dog reacting with terror every time she tried to make a specific phone call. Not just once, every time. The phone never rang. She always hesitated. Later, she found out the person on the other end had been deeply manipulative. It was like he knew what I was about to do and begged me not to, she said. How do you explain that? There were no cues, just a shift in her will and a reaction from the one being who couldn't speak but heard everything. We often forget that thought is not static. It moves, it emits. And while other humans may miss your subtle transmissions, dogs don't. Their brains are wired to survive through connection, to read energy, not logic. So when you feel watched, when your dog stares into your eyes as if asking a question you haven't voiced yet, it may not be curiosity. It may be a response to something you didn't even know you were about to feel. Because if your dog is hearing your thoughts, then maybe the thoughts you've kept buried aren't as silent as you think. And one day, you may realize they've known your truth all along, long before you had the courage to speak it. There are ruins scattered across the earth, stone circles, forgotten temples, underground shrines, where stories persist of dogs that never left. Not through force, not through domestication. They stayed, slept in the entrances, stood at the corners, barked into the wind when no one was there. And for centuries, local elders whispered the same thing. They're not guarding the site, they're guarding the space. But what kind of space demands protection from something we can't even see? In Göbekli Tepe, one of the oldest ritual sites ever discovered, archaeologists unearthed canine bones positioned next to ceremonial tools untouched for over 11,000 years. Similar patterns were found in pre-Druidic altars in Wales, where dog remains were carefully buried facing outward, as if watching. These weren't food animals. They weren't farmed. They were stationed, and always in the same places: thresholds, crossings, gates. Why would ancient cultures across continents assign the same role to the same animal? Spiritual systems from the Andes to Siberia refer to boundary guardians, beings whose role is to hold energetic integrity between worlds. In Buddhist monasteries high in the Himalayas, monks describe dogs who appear only during intense ceremonies, often lying at temple doors or following initiates during silent meditations. They call them Chorten Kutta, dogs of the stupa. No one trains them, no one feeds them, and yet they return, not because they are owned, because they are called. What's more, these dogs seem to appear when something is about to open. A portal, a breakthrough, a collapse. In interviews collected by Sacred Geographies, explorers in the Peruvian jungle tell of temples where dogs appear moments before rituals begin, walking silently around participants, never interacting, only observing. One participant said, "It was like they were watching the boundary, not of the room, but of us, of our minds." Could it be that these animals aren't protecting places, but protecting consciousness? If this is true, then what does it say about the dogs who suddenly fixate on your meditation space, or who sit by the front door during full moons, or who become agitated when you handle old family relics? We laugh it off. We call it sensitivity. But what if they're responding to energetic ruptures we're too dulled to perceive? What if sacred space isn't a place, but a state? And the dog is its first and final guardian? Because if they've guarded sacred ground for millennia, you have to ask, what sacredness still lives inside you? And what is your dog standing watch over now? Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, you notice something strange. Your dog lifts its head, looks at a corner, and begins to move, as if following someone's steps. But no one's there. You sit still, holding your breath, and then it happens again. A tilt of the head, a twitch of the ears, a slow pacing across the room in a rhythm that matches nothing you're doing. Not you, not the house, as if it's mimicking something or someone you can't see. These moments aren't as rare as you'd think. Across spiritual forums, from Spiritual Unexplained to the Lucid Mind Collective, people have begun documenting experiences of their dogs responding to invisible cues. Commands never spoken, gestures never made. One woman in Poland filmed her dog backing away from a shadowless corner of the kitchen, mirroring the exact posture she makes when startled, except she hadn't moved. The dog was copying something else entirely. Edgar Cayce, in one of his fragmented trance sessions, mentioned a phenomenon he called echo forms, energy bodies that temporarily detach during altered states of consciousness. These aren't ghosts. They're projections of ourselves, created during deep fatigue, trauma, or spiritual disconnection. Cayce believed that animals, particularly dogs, respond to these forms instinctively, sometimes following them, sometimes fearing them, sometimes trying to warn us of them. Advanced meditators and breathwork practitioners have shared similar stories, their dogs suddenly growling or pacing during breath sessions, especially as their body entered hypnagogic states. One practitioner recounted how her dog stood up and began turning in circles in the exact rhythm of her breath, then froze, staring at her from across the room, trembling. It was like he saw something separate from me, but made of me, she said. What are dogs seeing in those moments of altered perception? From a quantum perspective, if consciousness is not fixed but fluid, then what we think of as ourselves may not always be in one place. Pieces of us drift through memory, imagination, trauma, dreams. Dogs, with their nonlinear perception, may be tracking those pieces, trying to herd them back, trying to warn us when we've left a part of ourselves behind. Or worse, when something else has stepped into that space. Because when your dog starts copying movements that don't belong to you, it's not about behavior. It may be your first glimpse into a presence you've been carrying, but never knew had separated.